Yeah, sorry about the internet. It died at 3:59 and the call was at 4, so it was just a classic Comcast special.
Oh, you say classic Conrad special?
Comcast special.
Oh, you are located in San Francisco, is that correct?
I spend about 1 week a month, sometimes more, in San Francisco. I spend the rest of the time in New Hampshire.
Okay, you're bi-coastal. I notice
Yes.
that's typically the people you see from elsewhere in the U.S. Well, maybe not born elsewhere. It sounds like you might have been born somewhere else, but people I see from elsewhere in the U.S. are either from very nearby or all the way on the other side of the country, with the occasional Michigan or Texas or something. Um, so the Northeast to Bay Area pipeline is real.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in the UK, in England, in the countryside, and moved to Massachusetts for high school, and then college in New England, and then some time in New York, and then eventually ended up out in San Francisco for a few years, and then moved back to the East Coast during the great pandemic of 2020. I mean, we left, and 1 month before the pandemic, we just happened to move out of San Francisco. So yeah, all my friends were texting me asking, "Hey, just in case the world ends, can I come up and hang out with you for a bit in New Hampshire?" And yeah, I let them know we had lots of room and it'd be fine.
Yeah, I have a special connection to England. My sister lives over there, and she's done pretty well for a girl from Sacramento. And I also have a kind of on and off co-host on this little show that I do named Hagulian. I actually don't know his first name. I could find it, but all this time I've been dealing with him. I sort of kept his anonymity. But he's a British guy who lives out in Poland now, and much more literary than I. I'm kind of a you know tech adjacent in the sense that I don't pay a lot of attention to literature. I'm kind of immersed in just the kind of new omnipresent media in all its forms, and the written word has been sort of downgraded in my imagination over time. But
Yeah, it's very
yes,
tragic, but that also describes me.
yeah, okay. So you get a little bit about your background. So I came to you because I read a piece of yours on certain characteristics of San Francisco and how the violence there, not murder and rape level violence, but the kind of lower level crimes that still result in damaged property and bad vibes and bad feelings. How that San Francisco phenomenon of this ongoing tolerance of or low level crime actually has something to do with the makeup of the city's professional class. And the title of that paper is, or the piece on Substack is Escalation Theory: Compliance, Violence, and Overachievement in Society.
Yep.
How elites cause crime by acing marshmallow tests. Now, it's a little counterintuitive, right? You think, how can these people who can ace a marshmallow test tolerate crime? Which, after all, comes from people who are probably very bad at marshmallow tests. Do you want to explain
Yeah.
the link there?
Yeah, and it's a very Conrad essay, and it's a bit of a touchy subject. So I tried to sort of, it's very long for anyone who looks at it, and I tried to dance around it a little bit. But you know, I would say, just to touch on the uh orthodox view before I describe my own heterodoxy. The orthodox view, if you ask people like, why is there crime, right? I mean, depending on who you speak to, you'll get a couple bunch of different answers, but mostly, no matter who you're talking to, the ideas kind of tend to line up and be pretty similar. It's like, either it's deprivation, right? People have like needs and they're driven to crime, or it's opportunity, or there's not enough police presence and enforcement, and people just sort of do these crimes of opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, no matter which side of the aisle you're talking to, or whatever belief someone might have, most of the focus on what drives crime is focused on the psychology of the criminal themselves, right? Um, and everyone's even though there's a lot of disagreement at the surface level, I think there's actually tremendous agreement on like the underlying sort of meta level lens to bring to bear on the subject. And I think most of that stuff's probably fair, right? I'm sure you could run some nice meta studies and like get some stuff of like there's probably some reasonable elements to all of it, right? Like all of my views are sort of nuanced, and I'm happy to sort of just concede ground if anyone wants to challenge some part of their view as being real and legit. But I think the part of it that's like radically underexplored is to turn the lens not on the people who do the crime, but on the people who, for better or worse, comprise the elite of any given society, and therefore, no matter how democratic the society is, no matter even when they go, if you take a full communist society, it's really the elites that set the tone for a lot of what happens. They set the incentive structure, they set the culture, they have tremendous outsized influence on media. Essentially, your regional culture, your regional society is heavily dictated by your elites and their preferences. And these things tend to be relatively static. They change, but they're pretty consistent. They don't change like year to year. They change like half century to half century or something like that, or quarter century. And so there was this. This is just that's like a general high level belief that I've had for a long time, which is just like always look at the other side of whatever the hot button issue is. And in this case, obviously a lot of people care about crime. I as a father, I care about not subjecting my family to crime. But all of the conversations around it revolve around, yeah, the criminal mind basically, and like or what are the drivers of crime from a what drives somebody to crime standpoint that's focused on the perpetrator. And yeah, so I was kind of curious about this. I have this lens that just says look at the other side. And then I read this piece by this new online sensation called, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Crimea or something like that. He's on Twitter. I
Yeah,
link him right
yeah,
at the beginning of my essay. And he wrote this piece about like how if you use pretty good crime data from Venice, right, Renaissance era Venice, when it was like the jewel of Europe, and was regionally dominant in the same way that sort of San Francisco and maybe New York are regionally dominant today in America. Actually, crime in general, and all crime, and especially violent crime, was overrepresented among the elites. And he had a really good analysis, and I thought the analysis was excellent. But the conclusions and the take was sort of, again, very focused on like the perpetrator of the crime, right? So like and he's a bit of an edgy poster, and I obviously disavow anything he says that's a little too edgy. But he was trying to make this argument that like basically these elites were sort of genetically predisposed to violence, and eventually they all killed each other and selected themselves out of the gene pool or something, right? Kind of like this, like it's a very Twitter level argument, but he made a good case with all his data. But obviously, bringing the Conrad lens to things, I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, here's a question for you: how do you become an elite in ancient in Renaissance Venice, right? And and everyone thinks of Venice as like this nice little city with beautiful art and all this stuff, right? But like the harsh reality of life is anytime you see beautiful buildings, that came after the initial rise to economic glory, right? Like the beautiful buildings in Liverpool, England, made of marble and stone and granite, are all built from 18th 19th century mercantilist trade in opium, basically. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm like, how do you become an elite in Venice, right? And you can just I always love quoting Wikipedia because it's just this source that everyone can go. Everyone goes and clicks your links. They want to argue with it, and you can just read about you know the wars with the Ottoman Empire and the trade routes and everything. And if you understand how trade and wealth works I don't know, pre World War One or something, right? For 500 years, maybe thousands of years, trade is a geopolitical exercise, right? Like you don't become wealthy on trade without uh, putting swords on your boats or guns on your boats, because your neighbor will try and take your boats, right? Like every nation who became wealthy through through trade pre World War One had to be explicitly a what's the word, like a militaristic nation. And so, like, of course, the way you become wealthy in Venice is either directly or indirectly, right? Like, you can fund someone else doing it if you want. You can be one layer removed from the bloodshed, but like, you're not really two layers removed. You're pretty close to it. Um, and yeah, so basically, my pitch is that these elites, whether or not you think this is like genetic or cultural, is kind of irrelevant. The society itself is created or was created, or the incentives were created, or they just simply were such that people who were um, relatively open to the idea of violence, self-interest, the necessity of living in a violent world to protect your own interests, all these sort of various low-level personality traits. All of those people were massively selected into the cream of their society's crop, and then that would obviously have impacts, fault like downstream impacts on the sort of low-level policies that those people would implement.
See, that's
So
interesting. Yeah, no, because obviously in the modern day we think of the propensity to dispense violence as associated with the lower class. But if you can
exactly.
take like kind of a low class, high crime part of a major city in the U.S. right now, and look at like let's say let's select the more studious young men who don't really want to engage in violence. They would just like to keep their head down, do their schoolwork and then get out of that community. Imagine they couldn't get out of that community. They were actually stuck there. It would not actually be favorable to not be willing to use violence. You would not be at the top of that society. You'd be at the bottom. You'd be a constant victim. So that the fact that they have the ability to escape is why we associate, violence with criminality, because there is a tier above the local criminal boss that is much more high status. And so, but yes, it's as if the Venetian society was more like the South Side of Chicago or something, but with a Venetian
Yeah,
spin.
but I mean, but more competent, right? Like, I mean, but like truly, I mean, there was one of the most depressing realizations that I had was writing this long essay called "The Full Stack of Society" 5, 6 years ago now, when I was trying to figure out for myself, like, okay, I don't really agree with the big picture narratives that most people have around how wealth is created at a macro level. I just think that's like so it's so simplistic, and they don't think they sort of backtest very well on histories. But I didn't understand what was going on, so I wrote this long, sort of magnum opus type piece on like the different ways that successful societies have built wealth. And like the thing that I came to is like the first layer is this. I called it feudal layer, but you can call it whatever you want. But really, it's a guy with a sword picking up the sword and being like, all right, this is my area. This is my place, and you guys are gonna work the fields. And you roll the clock forward 2,000 years, and it's always funny. Like I read this tweet 2 weeks ago from someone who I like a lot. I follow a lot of his tweets. He's Wayne. He's a great guy. But he had this tweet that was like, history was not a meritocracy, and then circa the modern era, it became a meritocracy. And it's always funny to me how the instinctive aversion that we all have as modern people to the idea of like a hereditary aristocracy, or even just aristocracy, right? Like rule of the best, which is a totally legitimate aversion that we have to it as mostly liberal, mostly, democratic, mostly Republican slash democracy
Yeah.
liking people. But if you roll the clock back 2,000 years and you just lived in the jungle, what was the measure by which somebody became a lord and somebody didn't,
Yeah, you can
right?
imagine the
W-
merit of
It's
violence.
yes, it's I mean that was like the base, like the sort of awful pre-enlightenment, pre-civilization level of society is horrific. And it's you can sort of see this thing at like the tiniest microcosm on the playground or in any scenario. Like if somebody asserts dominance and you like that person and you think they're reasonable and like they're not gonna be a total, jackass about it, a lot of people will be like, "All right, cool, let's just go along with the flow and like get with the program, and then we don't have to have any fighting." Um, and if people don't agree, then they have fighting, blah blah blah. This is obviously like a two-dimensional. Like I'm drawing with crayons here, okay? I'm not like sketching the fine, but anyway, yeah, I just kind of had this realization that like actually in a true jungle of society, pre modernity, um, the guy with the lord title actually kind of earned it in a very unpleasant way, but he did earn it. and and there's a lot of sort of repercussions of that. Anyway, so yeah, it's like the Venetian nobles, they kind of earn it in the same way. Obviously, like modern America doesn't look anything like that, right? we there was this little video on Twitter of some San Franciscan, or maybe it was San Jose, like mayor being like accosted by someone on the street trying to start a violent
Yeah,
confrontation with
I
them,
saw that.
and it's hilarious. If yeah, so a lot of people messaged me about it because it was obviously on brand after my essay. But if you watch the clip and just watch everyone who's not involved in the scuffle, they have all the same mannerisms. They're wearing suits, they pull out their phones, and it's this like reflexive calling of an authority that is calling of an authority that is sanctioned, and I mean sanctioned truly on like a legal and moral and spiritual level, to rectify the situation up to and including the use of force. But like those people themselves are beyond that and above that, right? Um, anyway, so yeah, the modernity obviously looks nothing like that. Obviously, in America, I think this most people who are, if you're following along with what I'm saying, can kind of see that the way that you become an elite today is heavily focused on what I call the desire to pass tests. Basically, you just have to ace marshmallow tests for like 2, 3, 4 decades, depending on how quickly you advance. And you have to start acing marshmallow tests from age like 11, maybe 15 if you're late, maybe earlier. And that is that is very tough to do. It selects for people who often have a whole host of other sort of character traits. But if you pass enough marshmallow tests, you get sort of untold wealth and prosperity in America, at least, and it's wonderful and marvelous. And some of those marshmallow tests mean like studying for the SAT, even though you're a hormonal teenager or something like that, right? And some of the marshmallow tests mean not hitting somebody back when they hit you in class, and right, like if you ask people to give a explanation of when violence is acceptable, there is one universal answer that will never get you condemned or put you at risk of confrontation in an elite circle, right? And that answer is very simple. It's never. Violence is never acceptable. Which is conveniently the same answer that gets you through all the marshmallow tests from age 5 through to 25.
I actually thought you were going to say the one thing that they would not attack you for is to say self-defense,
No, are
because
you kidding? That's the first
non-aggression.
rule. No
I
way.
mean, well,
No,
yeah,
that's I mean, you might agree with that in principle, right? Like the sort of libertarian non-aggression principle is marvelous. You can defend it any way you like.
because saying never and saying that you would never ever dispense violence, that actually I think that seems low status. I don't think they would. I think they would
No, it's the
was
highest
sort of
status.
mealy mouthed and half-assed. It's just kind of
And
what surely you can think of some. This
no,
kind
man,
of
you've
kumbaya
got to we
pathological is not.
our elite virtues are fully established on turning the other cheek. I'm not saying whether or not I agree with these is a separate thing, and whether or
Oh
not
yeah, I
that's
know.
like sort of philosophically defensible is a separate thing. But turn the other cheek is like truly embedded, and not just turn the other cheek, but uh, you know, dial the cell phone, ask the teacher. Um, truly, there is a zero tolerance policy at like the psychic level for these things, right? Zero tolerance policy means if somebody hits you at age when you're in kindergarten, when you're in school, you get suspended if you hit them back. Um, even if you feel like genuinely right, there's no like qualifier that ever gets you out of that, right? Um, so yeah, I understand all of the justifications for the non-aggression principle and self-defense and all this stuff, but truly, in a sort of spiritual sense, the elite value that you can never be ostracized for your lack of willingness to use violence.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm conflating some of this perhaps cosplay radicalism and disdain for centrism and both sidesism, and there's a peaceful way out. I feel like that's kind of gone out of fashion. But at the kind of level of just interpersonal uh, lay psychology in a kind of miscellaneous circumstance, perhaps that's correct. And I'm conflating that with official discourse somehow. But
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing that you sanction your political allies to do, and the thing that you would you know, and it is a little different from what you would encourage your children to do, or what you'd invite a dinner guest over for, right? And sort of the cocktail party types in both sides will probably be willing to sanction their allies doing certain things in the grand culture war that's so
right,
horrible.
even the
But
word
but they would
ally
never.
is kind of this militaristic term that's taken off in recent years.
Yeah, I'm obviously very cynical about the whole thing, and I apologize if other people are not yet as cynical as me. Maybe it's just my immigrant perspective on it all. But I do very much see that none of the people who even condone things, like even the most horrible levels of violence that you see like randomly condoned on Twitter, like people will be like, oh yeah, what did you think decolonization meant, or blah blah blah, right? We must like on
Yeah,
both
revolution is
any
not a
side
tea
you want.
party and so forth.
Yeah, and there's I don't even wanna say it's funny, I feel more comfortable saying that stuff out loud than saying the other side stuff out loud, because even just saying it is, like, instantly just annihilates you even if you're condemning it. Um, so, like but the people who will not chastise those people for saying it would never invite them round to their house, like, which is almost a little different from the '60s era maybe, where yeah, oh god, what was that piece? I remember reading some article about criticizing champagne liberals, where they were like cocktail parties and then revolutionaries at the same thing in New
Oh,
York or whatever. But
is that Norman Mailer? Mau Mau and his
it this
Jersey
is like, yeah, it's a long time ago. But
Black
that
Panther.
anyway, that's not the scene today, right? The scene is like, you're an elite at you work your company job, and maybe you post some like mild revolutionary statements on your Twitter, or maybe you have like your secret anonymous based account on Twitter or whatever it is, like, but like real talk, you're not actually like you would consider it low status to actually engage in these behaviors, because you'd be punished
Yeah,
for doing so, because it's not how you make money, like, it's not the path to wealth, which was kinda like the foundation of my point, is, like, all of this stuff is the cultural critique's fine, but all of it's downstream from how money is created or wealth is generated.
yeah, and that's another aspect of your piece I thought was interesting. It's kind of coming from a I'm not going to say, well, I guess I'll use the words right materialist. I know you're staking a claim to be right wing, perhaps, but the point is, it's a kind of criticism of San Francisco culture, but not from a kind of moral failure sort of perspective, but kind of a materialist. And it's kind of looking at the composition of the industry there and how that affects who lives there. Reminds me of a blogger named Agnostic. He's had a blog for a long time called Face to Face, and he doesn't do the Substack. He still has a blogspot.com thing going on, but
Ah,
he's interesting in that way too. He looks at the composition of Democrats and how they tend to comprise the kind of information sector, whereas Republicans are in the extractive industries and materials, and that actually kind of shapes their worldview. And in the case of conservatives, they'll have a kind of scarcity mindset, 19th century, don't put up with crime, that the thing that is damaged cannot be easily regained. Whereas if
uh-huh.
you're in a kind of digital sector, you see your product as kind of infinitely replicable, and that might actually affect how much you take property crime seriously.
Yeah,
Or
exactly,
don't.
like, the framing of your sentence there was like, Republicans are in the extract, like, these materialistic, uh, industries, and maybe Democrats are more
Agriculture.
in, knowledge-based work is what is, I think, what we call it. But like, the inverted phrase is exactly as you put it at the end there, which is just being involved in work that is inherently, like, just creates spontaneously value out of like words. Often it's literally just you say stuff and then you get money. Um, or versus, you have to at the end of your shift, you have to spend half an hour like, changing the fluids in your heavy machinery, because eventually it deteriorates and
Right.
breaks
You
on
you
you,
could see how the
and then you
former
get a
would
personal
actually
injury.
you could see how the former might actually lend itself to social construction. Like, look at everything we've done just by talking and by
Right, a
presenting.
and simultaneously, you can see how the latter might lend you to, like, massive resistance to change, and, like, because change, when you have a machinery, again, that breaks and then you lose a finger, like, you're inherently much more conservative about these changes. If it was working and I'm getting paid and I'm not losing fingers, don't change things, right? Um, and you see all of it, you see both sides, you see them all play out, and you're just like, "Okay, maybe you could just consider the world through the everything is downstream of economics lens," and then I find that tends to be freeing, and it tends to offer me perspectives beyond the sort of endless culture war.
Yeah. Um, you know, not being quick to anger, kind of pivoting back to the discussion a few minutes ago, not
Mhm.
being quick to anger is thought to be, a positive character attribute. And the way that people discuss this stuff is, if you can keep your emotions in check, that's you're taking the high road. But if I'm being honest with myself, that's uh, not the high road because I'm not predisposed to use violence. Like, I'm not an elite at the level of those described in your piece, but I'm pretty sure I lean that way. I'm a NorCal college boy, worked in tech. I'm not that different. So for me, the easy thing to do is not get angry. Taking the high road might actually be working myself into a sense of vengeance and willingness to use violence. That wouldn't be a. It might still be a character flaw for various reasons, but the idea that you're resisting what's easy by not being quick to use violence, I think is wrongheaded. I would prefer not to. It would be harder. It'd be the harder road for me to use violence.
That's interesting. I actually cut I cut about 2 or 3,000 words out of the essay, and then someone commented something similar to what you just said. I think his name was A. Dane or something like that. I don't really remember. And it was a good comment. So then I just pasted, every author who cuts words out of their pieces just loves loves any excuse to repaste them back in, and all my stuff should be cut down half as much again. Um, but it was the bit that I cut out was trying to, and I cut it because I just felt like it was adding a lot of words to say stuff that was a bit more nebulous, but it was getting to the different inherent psyches that you have when you are somebody who has like these different natural dispositions that you talk about, right? And I talked about kind of code switching being the thing that's actually most not terrifying, but most worthy of condemnation is not somebody who is actually inherently predisposed to violence and signals that, because no matter how successful you've been passing marshmallow tests, you have been at some point in your life, especially. Well, I don't want to use a gender thing, but obviously boys tend to have slightly higher predispositions to physical aggression. So like especially most young boys, if you're ever exposed to them in school, but also girls, although they do it in different ways, you'll have been exposed to violence, and you'll know what I'm talking about when I say like some kids they were just quicker to hit you or like to hit other people, right? And you all learned hacks for how to navigate your life around those kids because they tended not to be too hard to model mentally, and they tended to be pretty predictable, and you could do certain things that would not provoke them, right? And like I'm describing simultaneously the experience that I had in like middle school and junior and before that as a child, and also the experience walking around San Francisco, right? These are actually the same set of behaviors that you learn to, right? It's like downcast eyes, avoiding confrontation, like just being silent, trying to be with other people because like three people is like a nice little group, right? Like these are like just basic sort of animalistic human behaviors, and they help make life more predictable when you're around somebody who is maybe slightly more likely to hit you for no reason, right? Or at least for a reason you don't think is fair. And in predicting that psyche and that behavior, it becomes understandable, and in being understandable, it tends to become less less disdainful, right? Like it's you're like, okay, I understand this person, even though that person doesn't understand you and would probably hit you if you said the wrong thing. The thing that is actually, sorry to be long-winded here, but the thing that really gets you kicked out of the system is to be one of those kids, to be one of the little gang of 3 or 4, one of the kids who never hits anyone, one of the kids who goes along with things, you avert your eyes, you don't engage in the boisterous confrontation that especially again a lot of younger boys use to figure out social status until one day you do. And that boy, the boy who does it one day, just one day randomly, and violates everybody's social expectations, sort of gets condemned much more readily than the person than if he'd just gone along with um if he'd never done it, or if he'd been displaying violence all the time, right? You understand what I'm getting at? Like this, he reveals
Right.
himself in that moment to have been wearing a mask, and to be able to code switch between the mask and not somehow, and to have previously been able to pass marshmallow tests, and then all of a sudden to decide consciously not to. Like he reveals himself as like you thought he was one kind of creature, but now he's a different kind of creature. And obviously I won't even talk about it explicitly, but obviously American culture today has like really horrific examples of this happening, but it happens on a micro level all day, every day, like in real small levels, right? And that's its own lesson that you learn, right? And that also gets reinforced as like even if so you said you were, you are someone who with a relatively low predisposition to hitting other boys, right? Um, Even if that weren't the case, if you were sufficiently good at passing marshmallow tests, you might be indistinguishable to everyone else around you. And those are the people I find that tend to get condemned most harshly by our sort of culture today.
Yeah, the kinds of people who would not themselves dispense violence, but even talk about how it's necessary to use violence. They kind of occupy this middle ground between being an actual perpetrator of violence and being the perfectly, San Francisco professional class marshmallow kid. The people who are willing to actually call out those who are violent and the necessity to tamp down on them probably are themselves slightly more likely to engage in violence. Um, I think, and you
That's
see some of this
yeah,
play out with Republicans. So Republicans will not be shy about calling out Democrats for not clamping down on their violent cities, and you actually see a more pugilistic spirit among them in Congress, say, than you would with Democrats. So, and that allows the Democrats to to look at these uncouth Republicans and say, well, what they're saying about clamping down on or tamping down on crime shouldn't be trustworthy because look, they basically are kind of thugs themselves.
yeah,
But
right. Like yes,
somebody's got to wade into that water and say that we need to do something, right?
and well, no, no, a I mean, maybe not, right? I don't know if anyone should be wading into that water, but yes, you end up with people who are, sort of. I mean, how do you describe the political class in America, right? Like they are.
I'm sorry.
Um,
A quicker way of putting that would be to say that police themselves are just a little bit thuggish from the perspective of the professional class, and yet we're not going to defend the
Absolutely.
police, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, yeah, I mean, to even, I mean, I put this photo that I took candidly from myself because I was in San Francisco when Gavin Newsom was sort of motivated via shame. At least that was my take. Like Xi Jinping kind of shamed him into using a level of state violence to clean the city up over a couple week period that was bizarre and very out of character and created this very strange step function in what happened in the city. And I was there at
Yeah,
the time,
it's
and
really it's
I
really illuminating. It tells you that they can do something when they want to, which is a little bit hopeful, actually.
And yeah, and then but then I was in the hotel, and it just happened that they sort of brought in 300 armed police, and they were all staying in the same hotel as me. And I'm going to my meeting with my nice little professional backpack or whatever. I just look like I'm just a normal tech worker, and there were literally 100 armed police in my lobby, and just psychologically, as much as I enjoy the clean streets of San Francisco, for the 10-second walk between the elevator bank and outside, I wasn't like completely at ease to be surrounded by 100 armed men and women, like just like loitering. It's just like like spiritually, I wasn't like, oh great, this is wonderful. Like those people are not people that I immediately had affinity with.